We want to look at the political engagement of African and Muslim immigrants in Minnesota. We have two guests who will be talking about the voting history of these new Americans, their political priorities, and the reasons that are driving them to the polling stations. There is Hibah Ansari, a reporter for Sahan Journal, who has covered everything from politics to culture and religion. We also have Mustafa Jumale, who is a political director for Voice for Refuge Action Fund and co-founder of the Black Immigrant Collective. Welcome, Mustafa and Hibah. I wanted to start. Yeah, thank you. I wanted to start with you, Hibah. When we talk about Muslims in Minnesota, we are, of course, not talking about one community. How diverse is the community? And what did you observe in your reporting regarding the political engagement of Muslims in the state?
Yeah, so it's quite diverse. You obviously have the East African here, but you also have Indian Muslims, Pakistani Muslims, Arab Muslims, etc. involved here in Minnesota. Today, actually, I've been covering the state house race in District 37B. Amir Malik is the DFL candidate there, and he's Pakistani. He's running in Blaine, which is a fairly split district, and the Republican incumbent Nolan West won by just razor-thin margins in his last two elections. So in 2018, Amir lost by just 150 votes. And so he's seriously upped his door-knocking game, even during the pandemic, because that's the best way to reach his voters right now. In 2018, he actually registered about 1,000 new voters, most of whom were actually Muslim. But this time around, he's definitely expanded his reach beyond that too. So it looks like he definitely has a strong chance. But that's been an interesting race to follow.
Yeah, that's good. And I know that you have spoken with voters about their hopes and fears for the elections. What have they told you?
So most of the people that I've spoken with say that they are afraid that if the president loses, he won't accept the outcome. And they, like all of us, are hoping for a graceful transition of power. The Somali community specifically is also afraid that if Trump does win, he'll continue to attack the community here in Minnesota, especially, whether that's at rallies or even through further restriction on immigration for Somalis and for people from Muslim majority countries in general. Another concern that, of course, isn't really Muslim specific, but it has affected immigrant communities disproportionately is the pandemic. People that we've spoken with just want this to be over, and because they're impacted at higher rates, that hope that we can enter this new administration with a better pandemic response is that much higher.
Iba, I understand you did a story with some first-time voters, and they're not only first-time voters, but they're trying to recruit other people in their communities to vote. What do you think? You kind of touched on a lot of the really remarkable, crazy things that have happened this year, but why do you think this, what about this election stands out to you as being so critical?
Yeah, I think what stands out to me in terms of how the Muslim community has become more mobilized is just the enthusiasm and the recognition that the stakes are high for us. So, for example, like you said, in terms of first-time voters, I think you were referencing Abdullahi Farah, who I wrote about in my story. He hadn't voted for 15 years. He just didn't feel like it was important. And now he's one of the lead organizers of a group called Faith in Minnesota. He also founded the Muslim Coalition, which is a group of 20 mosques that are trying to get Muslims more civically engaged here. So when it comes to Muslims like Abdullahi, for example, they became mobilized after their mosque was bombed in 2017 by white supremacists. The mosque is called Dar al-Farouk in Bloomington. So it isn't just a policy that Muslims are concerned about. It's literally a matter of safety, which is a pretty compelling reason to get people to the polls. And like I said, since then, some 20 mosques in Faith in Minnesota specifically came together to door knock for candidates who don't just acknowledge the Muslim community, but have their best interests in mind too. They're also phone banking for them. They're driving people to the polls, handing out voter information at their mosques, which 20 years ago was pretty much unheard of. But yeah, the stakes are high for Muslims for a variety of other reasons too. We're concerned about affordable housing, healthcare, unemployment during the pandemic. Again, these are all issues driving Muslims to the polls. But because we've historically been sort of othered by the political establishment, people just weren't as enthusiastic about voting or getting involved as much as they are now. But in terms of how they vote, and maybe we're getting to that in a second.
No,
Go
no,
ahead.
go ahead.
Okay. I was going to say, in terms of how they vote, Muslims do tend to vote strongly Democrat, and they are definitely leery of Trump. The numbers do show that. But I guess the community here in Minnesota is really emphasizing not just increasing voter turnout, but to also get involved in other ways, whether that be through working on campaigns, negotiating with campaigns, or actually running for office.
And yeah, I mean, just one other quick question. So when you talk about, Muslims getting involved, are we talking about the younger people, the older folks, kind of, are they mixed, or most of the people that you have spoken with or have seen doing this work are younger people?
It's actually surprising, but it is pretty mixed. You would maybe think that younger Muslims are going to be more involved, but it is pretty mixed across the board. You have, a lot of elected officials from the Somali community in Minnesota who have been involved for a very long time. But then you have kind of newer voters, whether it's because they just turned 18 or they're just starting to kind of see the stake they have in the election, also becoming more involved. When it comes to volunteering, you'll have maybe older members of the community door knocking and talking to people face to face, but then you'll also have the younger volunteers phone banking and doing some of the social media and things like that. So it really does vary across the board. It also varies in terms of both men and women being involved at pretty much equal capacities, which is also really great to see. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's a lot. That's great. Mustafa, I wanted to turn to you. African immigrants, especially Somalis, have lived in Minnesota, of course, for a very long time, 30 years and more. But their political participation has never been this conspicuous. What has changed over the past decade? I mean, I'm very obsessed with this fact that in 2016, Abdi Warsame was the highest official, and he was only city council. And now we have, Ilhan Omar, and then 2 state legislatures. Maybe Abdi Fatih may win. So when you look at the Black immigrant in Minnesota and their participation, what has changed over the past at least 4 years, but also going back to 10 years?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Ibrahim. Thank you for having me. I would say, just to take a step back, I would say like in the early 2000s, Somali nonprofit organizations like Somali Action Alliance, Iskuron, the Confederation of Somali Communities, and other C3 organizations have really built the base for the political power that particularly the Somali community has these days. They got a lot of folks civically engaged, encouraged many people to get involved in their neighborhoods at the city level, as well as help folks through the citizenship process. So I would say like the Somali community went from, over the last 20 years, from just being part of the political machine, like a reliant vote for the Democratic Party, to being elected officials themselves. I want to say the first Somali person who ran for office is this guy whose his name is Sadiq Warfa. I think these days he's a minister in Somalia. But Sadiq's race was unsuccessful. And right after him, we had the late Hussein Samatar run for office, and he was the first Somali person that was elected to office. So through this process, a lot of folks went from being like passive participants in our democratic process, in our civic process, to actually pushing against the democratic machine and challenging folks, challenging incumbents that have been in office for decades. Um, the case can be said for Ilhan Omar's first race against Phyllis Khan. Um, so I would say yes. So that's pretty much how this transformation happened.
Yeah, and you are the founding director of the Voice for Refuge Action Fund. You're also the co-founder of the Black Immigrant Collective. Um, but tell me a little bit more about the Voice for Refuge Action Fund and the role that it played in mobilizing these Black communities, especially
Yeah,
immigrants.
that's also a really good question. Um, so Voice for Refuge Action Fund is the first 501c4 organizations. And so C4 organizations can endorse candidates. They can be more political, more partisan. They cannot necessarily coordinate with candidates, but they can run their own phone banks in support of those folks and whatnot. And so Voice for Refuge Action Fund was created because this administration has systematically attacked Black and brown folks. Particularly, we have seen like how Black immigrants, particularly Somalis, been impacted by the Muslim ban. The refugee resettlement program under this administration was cut by more than 80%. Just last week, this administration decided that they were going to cap next year's admission numbers to 15,000, and that's the lowest it's ever been since 1980. And so, Voice for Refuge was created to really push back against these kinds of toxic policies that really divide um, communities. And so in Minnesota in particular, we've endorsed 43 candidates this election cycle, and the majority of them are in Minnesota. And so what we've been doing has been a lot of like messaging online, directing people to vote for candidates like Sahara Odawa, I think who's running in suburban Minneapolis. Um, there's a candidate in Wilmer, Ida, who's running for a city council seat. So for a number of those folks, we've been able to endorse them, direct our volunteers to them to support their candidacies. However, I will say in Minnesota, we can't necessarily take credit for Black turnout. Organizations like Iskuron, Minnesota Voice, ACER, which stands for African Career Resource Inc., really did a lot of work to mobilize folks out there. If I'm not mistaken, ACER hired like 45 Black immigrant youth to canvass their communities. And so I think a lot of folks know what's at stake. They know that their auntie or their cousin is in a refugee camp in Somalia, looking and waiting for these results tonight because that will decide really the fate of those folks. And we have felt this pressure, under this administration. He's come back to Minnesota, I want to say like 3 times, and called out the Somali community in particular. This is how he builds his base, right? This is how he activates this very racist, white supremacist kind of rhetoric that gets these folks out when we know refugees and immigrants have only been a boom to Minnesota. And so,
Yeah, and I think we have
yeah,
just 1 minute. What's your hope for the future for these communities? Maybe I could ask
my,
that.
yeah,
Go ahead, get Mustafa, you're fine.
well, I'll be really quick. I think a lot of us want normalcy. We know that this administration, this incoming administration, if it does happen, if Biden wins, which I'm crossing my fingers, it'll be a lot of work for us to really rebuild these programs that have been tarnished over the last 4 years, to repeal these very discriminatory policies that have been established by this administration. And so I think one is like, yes, a deep breath and back to normalcy, but also like making these programs even better than what they used to be. So I think a lot of us are just excited for that part.
Thank you both so much for your contributions. Take care of yourselves in the coming days.